This split-screen visualization illustrates India's macroeconomic paradox. On the left, we see classical structural transformation, the formal sector expanding at an impressive 6% annual rate. On the right, the labor distribution remains frozen, with 90% of the workforce trapped in the unorganized sector. The unorganized sector consists of low-productivity, informal roles that operate under strict demand constraints. The wealth generated by the top-line GDP surge simply bypasses this demographic entirely. We often assume that injecting aggregate demand into a growing economy will eventually force the labor market to modernize. The data proves otherwise. High top-line growth without labor absorption is not a policy accident. It is a mathematically predictable feature of a structurally heterogeneous economy. To map exactly why this happens, we rely on a three-sector structuralist model developed by researchers at UNCTAD. UNCTAD is an intergovernmental organization that promotes the integration of developing countries into the world economy. The model divides the economy into organized, unorganized, and agriculture nodes. The first two carry excess capacity, adjusting to shocks by expanding or contracting physical output. Agriculture operates under rigid constraints, meaning it adjusts strictly through price fluctuations. Recognizing these asymmetrical adjustment rules is necessary. It explains why standard Western macroeconomic policies, which assume uniform adjustment, fail to translate in developing nations. We can map the flow of money between these sectors using a social accounting matrix. A social accounting matrix is a data framework that records all transactions and intermediate demands between different economic actors in a given year. The Indian matrix reveals a critical flaw. Backward demand linkages, the flow of intermediate purchases from the organized back to the unorganized sector, are exceptionally weak. Furthermore, both sectors purchase capital exclusively from their own production lines. Capital does not cross borders. Because capital strictly loops back onto itself, the formal economy functions as an isolated enclave, scaling its own wealth while completely excluding the informal workforce. This isolation triggers a specific mechanical failure known as the Kaldor-Verdoorn effect. It is an economic principle establishing that the growth rate of labor productivity responds directly and positively to the growth rate of output. When investment capital drives up output, it creates dynamic economies of scale. Production rapidly accelerates. Consequently, labor productivity spikes. This creates a mathematical trap. If productivity outpaces output, the formal sector absorbs new demand without hiring a single new worker. The very dynamic efficiency that makes the formal sector profitable actively suppresses structural development. The informal workforce remains permanently locked out. The UNCTAD researchers ran a simulation to test this, injecting a 7% investment demand shock directly into the organized sector. That is roughly 10% of total GDP. This chart displays the expansion of organized employment. In Calibration 1's vacuum, the dark red bar shows employment rising fractionally. In Calibration 2, activating Kaldor-Verdoorn shrinks that bar. Finally, Calibration 3 adds trade elasticities, shrinking the bar further. Organized employment stagnates. Injecting capital into a formal enclave primarily boosts productivity and returns, completely failing to pull the reserve army of labor from the unorganized sector. The simulation also models price shocks. Looking at the chart's kink bars, if the organized sector artificially raises its nominal wage by 10%, the result points sharply negative across all calibrations. Organized employment severely contracts. The ripple effect is immediate. A formal sector wage increase raises goods costs, generating nationwide inflation. Because agriculture adjusts via price, food costs spike. This directly crushes the purchasing power of the 90% of workers trapped in the unorganized sector. Due to these structural bottlenecks, a policy intended to increase wealth in the formal sector functions as a regressive tax, contracting the broader national economy. This internal bottleneck scales up to the global macro level, directly refuting the popular 2012 narrative of BRIC decoupling. The decoupling theory assumes that massive emerging markets like Brazil, Russia, India, and China have grown enough to act as independent engines of global demand during Western recessions. A multi-country linkage analysis disproves this. In trade, backward linkages represent the demand pull a country exerts by requiring other countries' outputs. Forward linkages represent the demand push of supplying inputs. As the network graph shows, the US and Europe pull heavily on the rest of the world. The BRIC nations remain highly isolated. The global reality mirrors the domestic model. Because structurally heterogeneous economies lack internal demand multipliers, they cannot generate the external backward linkages required to sustain the global economy. Isolated investment shocks and uncoordinated export growth do not yield sustainable, inclusive development. The policy imperative is strict. Governments must explicitly engineer backward demand linkages for intermediate capital goods. Until formal capital is required to interface with informal labor,